It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, come on in. Want to welcome you in. It's a morning here, and I hope you're waking up and feeling good wherever you're at, really around the world with this podcast. And I hope you're not waking up sick and tired. I hope you're not waking up dope sick. A lot of people in this country have been. Hundreds of thousands of people have died because of the opioid crisis that has swept the nation and is still ongoing. It's a major calamity around the world, really, but the United States in particular has been particularly hard struck by this, and I wanted to bring on a friend of Podcast by George. We're delighted to have him on the show, and it's Chris McGreal from The Guardian, out of the UK, of course, and I'll read this just a little brief bio, basically, for Chris to get us going, to let you know a little bit about this guy's background. And again, you hear me at times on the podcast talk about bona fides. Well, this guy's got him. Chris McGreal, he's a reporter for The Guardian. He's a former correspondent in Johannesburg, Jerusalem, and in Washington, D.C., and he now writes from across the United States, and that's where I met him, out on the road. This guy does road work, folks. He's won several awards, including for his reporting of the Rwanda genocide, Israel-Palestine, and on the impact of economic recession in America. He received the James Cameron Prize for work as a journalist that has combined moral vision and professional integrity. He was awarded the Martha Gellhorn Prize for journalism for reporting that penetrated the established version of events and told an unpalatable truth. And I love that quote. Chris, come on in. I want to tell you, I just love that quote on that award, because to me that really strikes at the heart of journalism. If you're reading or you're viewing or listening to what you think is journalism and you like it all, and it's right in line with what you're thinking, it's probably not real journalism. It's got to be unpalatable at times, and yet Chris is not afraid to dig in there and get it. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Good morning, George.
We want to talk about this outstanding book that you've just authored, and that's really the genesis for the show. We want to acknowledge all of your work, obviously, but this is a kind of a magnum opus on this opioid crisis, and my God, I've been reading this book, and I would encourage everybody to pick up a copy. The title is American Overdose. It's the opioid tragedy in 3 acts, which is kind of interesting right off the top. Tell us, maybe to get us started here, Chris, tell us about the title and why the 3 acts.
Well, just to let you know that the paperback is out.
Yeah.
It's just come out, so it's an updated version with an afterword, which brings us bang up to date. A lot that's been happening with, obviously, the pursuit of these drug companies now that have actually been, behaving like corporate drug dealers. But the idea behind the book was really to look at why it's called American Overdose, because although, as you quite rightly point out, there are problems with opioids and the use of opioids and opioid overdoses in other countries, there's something unique about America, both in the scale. We're talking about 400,000 deaths now over the past 20 or so years.
Yeah.
And, that alone, indeed, is a huge figure. But when you think that's 400,000 dead, how many more people are dependent or hooked on these drugs, and the impact that has on their lives, and then all the people in their families and around them that are also impacted. You see that this epidemic, uniquely in America, I think, has impacted millions of people. And there are parts of this country you go to where there are entire communities that have been affected by this. And so I think that makes it quite unique in an American way. And I think the other thing that makes it quite unique is really that this was driven ultimately by corporate greed. If you look at Scotland, for instance, I come from the UK, and in Scotland, that now has a heroin overdose rate death to match that of the US. But the big difference is that the Scots that use heroin didn't get to that drug through prescriptions. And it's prescribing, it was marketing, it was the idea that these prescription opioids could be sold as a magic bullet that really led the United States down this path. And no other country has really followed it in quite the same way. So the three acts are essentially, I look at the origins of this epidemic. And like so many things in life, it kind of began with good intentions, with a group of doctors that actually looked at the use of morphine for end-of-life care, for people who are dying in great pain of cancer. And there was the hospice movement, which came out the UK and came to the United States. And those doctors looked at that and said, well, if we're using these drugs to treat people who are dying, why can't we treat it for everyday pain, for people living with, debilitating chronic pain that can affect your back, can affect arthritis, whatever. It can destroy your life. And they saw hope in that. The problem became once the drug companies saw an opportunity and they leapt onto that. And then what you see from that point is two things come together. You see the doctors that became evangelical about this. They set aside the science because there was a reason these drugs hadn't been prescribed en masse for a long time. And that was because people actually do become addicted to them. And the United States had a morphine epidemic 100 years ago. So much so that, in fact, President Teddy Roosevelt appointed the country's first drug czar, who described Americans as the world's worst drug fiends at the time. So the medical profession retreats from the wide use of morphine or morphine-based drugs, opioids, at that point. And what you see, these doctors who become evangelical about getting these prescription opioids out there again, is they actually start to massage the research and the science and misrepresent and underplay the dangers. And at the same time, you see the big drug companies. Purdue Pharma is, of course, the one that gets all the attention, but there were others there. I just sat through a trial in Oklahoma of Johnson & Johnson, which made very powerful opioids. And it did exactly the same thing, where they send their marketing department out to persuade doctors that these drugs are safe and effective, and they're not. And that's really, to me, that was one of the great shocks, is that, wow, you've got people who have no medical training, who are salespeople, going out and advising doctors on medical policy or medical treatment. So that's the first stage. The second stage is really about, the second act is really about how there was a moment in the early 2000s when actually there were plenty of warning bells, and you could have seen this crisis reined in before it became the tragedy that it became. And what you see is doctors ringing alarm bells and others, and the pushback from the industry when it really gets organized to get the drugs out there, to get doctors in hospitals and clinics prescribing, and they come under enormous financial pressure to prescribe, which I can go into more detail if you want.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt you. We've got a little delay on the line here, but that's something I wanted to get at, because when I'm reading this and I'm looking at it, I kind of look at things a little different than some people, but there's a couple of dynamics in play here, and I'm glad you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, because he understood that unfettered capitalism was not a good thing. He was the guy that broke up the monopolies back then, and I know you're a keen observer of what we're doing here in the States, and we've kind of taken up this mantra in this country that almost unfettered capitalism is the way to go at all costs. As long as your model is based on free-flowing commerce and business, you can't go wrong. The market will take care of everything and we'll all be all right in the end. Well, to me, this is a glaring example of the fact, in this category anyway, where that ain't true. And the other thing is, I know you touch on these things in the book, certainly, this thing that I call John Wayneism in this country. There's a belief by a lot of people that, well, this won't affect me. This won't get... I'm tougher than that. I'm an American. I can pull myself up by my bootstraps, and furthermore, anybody that can't do that has an innate weakness, and there's nothing to be done for them, and they just have to suffer the consequences. Is that a big factor of what's going on in this country and a big part of this puzzle?
Well, certainly the idea that business can regulate itself and that regulation is really burdensome on business played an important part in this. Not just with the opioid makers, but in general through the 80s, when you see under President Reagan the kind of erosion of regulation, the easing of regulation. One of the places you see that is with the pharmaceutical industry and the Food and Drug Administration. And you also see something that becomes really very important in this story, which is the idea that that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which authorizes these, approves these drugs, that it should work with the industry. That it's not just regulating it; it almost becomes a business partner, and the industry starts to pay through what sounds quite reasonable. Well, they should pay for the process of licensing their drugs, but the effect is that the FDA becomes more and more reliant on this money, and of course that has an influence. It spends a lot of time, therefore, talking to the industry in ways that perhaps aren't a relationship between a regulator and the regulated. And we've got to a point now where the division of the Food and Drug Administration that approves opioids gets 70% of its money from those opioid makers.
Of course, 70%. What did you say? 70%?
70.
Wow.
70%. And of course, the FDA, very strongly said, no, that has no influence. But I've spoken to people inside the FDA and very senior former officials who acknowledge that, of course, it does, because if nothing else, it buys you a hearing. And that's, in the end, what matters. And you see that influence, to be honest, in the original approval of OxyContin, the drug that Purdue Pharma put out. It was a lower level FDA official said that there had to be testing, and a more senior official overruled her and said, no, this drug can go on the market without any testing. We'll just essentially take the drug company's word for what it claims about the drug. That official then went, a couple of years later, was working for Purdue Pharma, which is the other issue here, the revolving door between the drug industry and the regulators. And in fact, we've just seen the former FDA official, Scott Gottlieb, the director of the FDA. He too has just joined a major drug company amid much controversy. So I do think that's part of it. I think the second part of what you were saying, I think you're right about there's certainly a sense of abandonment. I think partly in this particular case, it's because of stigma. People who become addicted to drugs are stigmatized, and particularly a drug that's close to heroin. But I think there's something else as well went on early on in this. Is if you look at the areas that were most affected during the first decade of this epidemic, they tended to be in Appalachia, for instance. They tended to be poorer communities, poor white communities that were often stigmatized as hillbillies.
Right.
And that did contribute, as you say, to the idea that we in middle-class America are not going to be affected by this. And of course, they were. It took time, but that the CDC has a map, and you look at it, and that map of prescription opioid overdoses, which begins in the late 90s, it glows initially in southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, and then you see it spread across the country. But there's where it began.
Yeah.
But it spreads to the entire country.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because the account, and this is the thing. We've talked about kind of the technical side of this to start with, but Chris is a great writer, and one of the reasons this book is so good, he puts a very human face on all of this, starting with the miners in Appalachia and the eastern part of the United States that he talks about. But this is a malaise across the United States. And Chris, my podcast is kind of a from the heartland type of thing, and Chris is, like I mentioned at the onset, he goes there. This guy moves around. He looks into all of these things in all of these parts of the country. What did you find of particular interest here in what we call the heartland, the Midwestern part of the United States?
I think one of the things which is very interesting is that not all areas were affected in the same way, and some areas, Oklahoma, for instance, continues to have a very high prescription drug problem, whereas other parts of the Midwest have shifted away from prescription drugs towards more use of heroin and fentanyl. But underpinning a lot of this is where the drug companies decided to market. So if you look at more rural areas, they basically didn't bother to target some of the less densely populated areas. They didn't think doctors were likely to prescribe that. There weren't that many doctors as far as they were concerned. And the areas that they initially targeted, like I say, in places like eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia, bits of western Virginia, Ohio, what they did was they went in where they saw that pain relief was already being used, where some form of pain relief was being prescribed, often much lower level opioids. And these tended to be areas where there was a very high proportion of the labor force was involved in manual labor. So they were working down the mines, they were cutting trees, whatever. And that, as time went on by, leads to people having a lot greater strain on their body. There's some really interesting demographics about this epidemic, which mark it out from other drug epidemics. And this is the biggest drug epidemic the United States has ever faced. But two things that really leap out is where it began. Most drug epidemics begin in the cities and spread. That's not true. Mm-hmm. This began in rural areas and then moved to the cities. And the other thing is, most drug epidemics hit the young disproportionately. In this case, because of what I described about who was initially targeted to get these prescriptions, for these prescriptions, it was actually the middle-aged. By the mid-2000s to late 2000s, you see that the single largest group of people using those drugs and becoming addicted and overdosing are middle-aged, 45 to 54 years old. And so those two groups, those two distinctions from the almost every other American drug epidemic tell you a lot about the nature of this. And so I think as you look around the country, at least initially, you can see where it flares up is where the drug companies targeted their marketing. And in some places in the Midwest, they didn't bother. They just simply decided not to go there.
Yeah, well, the other thing that was an eye-opener for me, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I get approached by people when in conversations we're talking and say, my God, why would anybody this day and age try heroin? How would they get started with that? Everybody knows what happens with heroin. Well, this opioid crisis was the link. That's what led to a lot of the heroin usage in the United States. It's less expensive, more easily available. I mean, that's why we have a kind of a sidecar epidemic in heroin, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one of the things that's very revealing now about the approach of the drug makers who are responsible for this epidemic is to try and say that the United States is not suffering a prescription drug problem. It's suffering from heroin and from fentanyl. Those are illegal drugs, so it's got nothing to do with them. But you can see very clearly that as overdoses rise in this country from prescription drugs, so you start to see people move over to heroin and to fentanyl. Until about 2010, it was very, very easy to get prescription opioids, and that's where most people went. But you see the drug cartels down in Mexico begin to realize that there's a market opened up again for heroin, and they move in with heroin to certain parts of the country initially, Florida, the Northeast, Texas, and what they do is they target those cities which are worst hit, becoming worst hit by the epidemic, and they undercut the price of prescription drugs. And also by 2010, you start to see a slight reining in, an awareness, and it's becoming harder for some people who've become very severely addicted to get as many prescription drugs as they need. So they start to use heroin alongside it. They'll use whatever they can get, to be honest.
Yeah.
And so that's when you start to see the rise of heroin. But what that has allowed the drug companies to do, what they've done, particularly as they're facing all these lawsuits, is to then frame this as a, quote, drug abuse crisis, and to essentially blame the victims, to call them abusers, and to say the problem is with them, not with the prescription drugs. But many of those people who do indeed go on to abuse drugs begin by following their prescriptions on opioids that they were told were completely safe and were non-addictive.
What was your finding, or what's your belief? A lot of people say some of this epidemic is because of our drug laws in this country, in particular particularly with marijuana, that if marijuana was legal and available and people could access and use that instead of these opioids, starting there for pain relief, that we wouldn't have had or wouldn't still have the issue with opioids and heroin that we have. What do you think about that?
I'm really not sure. I mean, I do know that if you look at West Virginia, which is the worst hit state for the opioid epidemic, marijuana was very widely available. So I'm not entirely sure that stacks up. I think the thing about opioids is they're so much more powerful, and I don't think marijuana can match that. Whether there were minors who told me, for instance, that one of the things they liked about opioids was that if they got drug tested for them, because as long as they had a prescription, there were no problems. Now, you're quite right. If you get tested for marijuana, of course, it costs you your job on the mines. So there was that illegality factor. But I think that much of this was driven by the false promise of these drugs and people becoming addicted. I'm not sure that having legalized marijuana back then, at least, would have made that much difference. I mean, the scale of the marketing by these companies, the push to get the drugs out there, and I'll give you perhaps one example of just how influential they were. What you saw in the United States was the medical industry take control of medical policy, which is really unusual in a country, a particularly developed country. And so at one point, the drug makers decide that what they need to do is to get doctors in hospitals prescribing opioids as the default means of treating pain. And the drug companies funded a number of supposedly independent medical professional organizations. One of them was the American Pain Society, which was pushing the idea of pain as the fifth vital sign. And that's the idea that, you can measure pain alongside your heart rate and your blood pressure when you go into hospital. And the American Pain Society, with funding from the drug industry through its lobbying groups and directing some drug makers, opioid makers, really pushed this, and it got on board something called the Joint Commission. The Joint Commission licenses hospitals in this country, and without that license, those hospitals don't get federal funds. They don't get Medicare and Medicaid funds, for instance. So hospitals really want to keep on the right side of the Joint Commission. And what you see is that essentially the APS almost enters into a financial transaction with the Joint Commission, where Purdue Pharma will provide the training to the doctors, will provide the manuals that the Joint Commission can then sell and make money out of. If this policy of pushing the pain as the fifth vital sign goes ahead. And that's why when you walk into a hospital, not anymore, but for a long time in this country, when you walked into a hospital, you would see the smiley faces on the wall and you would be asked, how much pain are you in?
Yeah.
And if the pain, if you said 5 or above, or a grimacing smiley face, then you would have to be referred for pain treatment. And that pain treatment, according to the manual from the Joint Commission, almost always steered people towards use of opioids. And other methods were actively discouraged by the hospitals, by the insurance companies, which also put pressure on doctors because they don't want to pay for physiotherapy, for instance, when they could pay for much cheaper pills, and it's also much quicker to prescribe a pill. And to reinforce this, the Joint Commission required hospitals to do patient satisfaction surveys. And as any doctor will tell you, when a patient walks in and says, I want a pill for my pain, if you don't give them that pain, they're going to be a very dissatisfied patient.
Yep.
And if they're a dissatisfied patient, the hospital gets bad marks. And if the hospital gets bad marks, the Joint Commission marks its license down, and you end up a loss of federal funds. So there was this enormous pressure, all generated by the industry, to oblige hospital doctors to prescribe opioids, basically as the default treatment for pain.
My God, well, thanks for sharing that. Well, we're just about out of time on the podcast already, and we've got a nice overview here, but we're just scratching the surface, folks, and that's actually good because I want everybody to pick up a copy of this book, and it's now out in paperback. Get it on Amazon, get it wherever you get books. It's American Overdose, The Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts by Chris McGreal. And before we lose you here, Chris, and you go on about doing this wonderful work that you do around the world, really. I know a lot of people that don't look that deeply into the news have heard about this Sackler family settlement, which I know you followed, and they believe, well, that's over with. The opioid crisis is behind us, and nothing could be further from the truth, correct?
Yes, I mean, it's not clear whether this Sackler family offer to essentially hand over Purdue Pharma and make it a trust, and the future profits from Purdue Pharma would go to, alleviate some of the consequences of the epidemic. Plus, Purdue family would give some of their money. The Sackler family would give some of the profits towards it. It's not clear if that's going ahead. It's divided the litigants. It's divided attorney generals in various states. But whether or not there's a deal on that, it doesn't begin to scratch the surface. Later this month, in 3 weeks, there's a case opening in Ohio, which will hear about 2,000 litigants against not only the drug manufacturers, but the drug distributors, all kinds of people who've been involved, the pharmacy chains, all kinds of people who've been involved in all of this, who have been responsible for the spread of opioid prescribing and dispensing. So, I mean, the Sackler offer, they're obviously the most prominent people and family involved in this, but it's a small part of the overall solution. Having said that, it's been quite interesting looking at how the Sacklers have responded to this. And whilst it looks like a generous offer, they're going to give up their company that they own. They would sell another company. They would hand over some of the profits from the sales, etc. Actually, the way they talk about this is very revealing of their true intent. The first thing is they offer no apology or acknowledgement for the terrible crisis that Purdue Pharma played a leading role in causing. And they also continue to blame the victims. They continue to talk about drug abusers rather than people who have been dragged into addiction with false promises for the drugs that Purdue Pharma sold, particularly OxyContin. And finally, they're actually giving up only, or offering to give up only, a fraction of the profits that came from OxyContin and the other opioids they made. It's not clear in the end how much they made. It's probably somewhere around $12 or $15 billion. They became one of the richest families in the country. And they're offering somewhere around $2.5–3 billion. So they still intend to try and hang on to an awful lot of their money. The money that was made from addiction and death.
Yeah, which always, whenever I hear that number, it's just incredible to me that those billions of dollars with a B, folk, that's what we're talking about here. It goes to show you how addictive and how cheaply produced and distributed, and what an issue this is on the American landscape. And for everybody that's listening, every American family, I think, I've been touched by it. My family has been. And this is a scourge that continues. And we want to thank our friend Chris McGreal for writing that book. Again, American Overdose, the Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts. And he's our guest, and we'll circle back. We'll pick up Chris again when he's out on the road, hopefully, because he's a hero of mine in the journalistic community at the very least. I mean, my God, what this man does. Great works. And again, thanks, Chris McGreal. But for now, right now anyway, that's going to have to do it. That'll be another podcast. By George.